Okay, can everyone hear me? I can't quite tell. Awesome. So I can tell this is going to be a tough crowd. I was chatting with someone before, and within about 90 seconds, I was schooled on the difference between a hypothesis and a thesis. So my deep academic credibility, which is very little, is totally going to come in handy here. So my talk is called Not Dead Yet, and so sustaining craft at the intersection of passion, community, and commercial value. You could say those last three things in whatever order you want. But obviously this comes from Not Dead Yet comes from Monty Python's Holy Grail, which may or may not be the reason I studied medieval history for my undergraduate degree, and probably should be required viewing for all school children once they reach a certain age. So, when I saw the theme for Monki Gras this year, first of all, I've been watching the past years on YouTube, and I always really enjoyed them. And I remember like Nordic craft. It was like, oh, that's awesome. Like I don't know anything about Nordic craft, but I'm in. And sustaining craft, that immediately got my brain going. And my medieval history major, which is now from a very long time ago, started thinking about what that means. And the first thought is like, oh yeah, well, medieval craft guilds and this emergence of organized groups of craftspeople, and this being kind of a really interesting part of the formation of a middle class, where folks were able to create a livelihood and sustain themselves without having a tie to either land ownership or an agrarian daily life. And but then you kind of think about, well, where did this go over time? And the craft guilds sort of amassed power. They essentially turned into these monopolistic forces for these trades. And as soon as some other technology comes along, they kind of ran into trouble, right? And so this is from Wikipedia, but what's kind of fun about it is these are the little crests. I think this is from somewhere in Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic now. Yeah, I should probably get caught up on the last 20 years. But like I said, I like the stuff from 500 years ago. So, and it's like, yeah, there's like the locksmiths and the whatever those people with the wheel and the strange axe thing, and they're all these hyper-specific crafts, and it's like they own the space and they know it really well, and they also eventually can prevent other people from joining it, and formalized apprenticeships and whatnot. And this stuff continued in many parts of the world into the 20th century, although things were changing. So as I kind of tried to abstract away from the details and think about, well, what drove these craft guilds over time, there's, as opposed to just an artist, right, or some other type of tradesperson, and you've got this intersection going on between, well, there's a community, right? The guild is the coming together of the people who share this skill set, and they kind of formalize certain things like the apprenticeship and master craftsmen and whatnot. But there's also this commercial value. Like at the end of the day, these craftspeople are, they're putting something together that can be sold in the market. So, and the question is like, well, is just having those two things enough to be sustainable? And that's where kind of like, I wonder, because as soon as some technology advancement comes along, then that's where things kind of tend to fall apart. But they don't completely go away in all cases. So you look at things like, this is a Vandercook letterpress. And full disclosure, I have a hobby of printmaking. Not all letterpress, I have taken classes in it. It's fun too, but I like relief printmaking. And so the question is like, why is this still happening? This is basically antiquated technology at this point. By the 1950s, you had offset printing taking over. And the peak of the kind of letterpress probably was the beginning of the 20th century. as I've clearly stated here, this is a totally unscientific diagram taken from random bits of anecdotal evidence found on the interwebs. But like, over here there was some guy and he printed this book like with movable type. I put 1702 because I actually found that, and this was, I thought, maybe relevant for this crowd. In 1702 is when they lifted this, ordinance or whatnot that basically said you can only print in London. And so this allowed printing to happen outside of London, which is kind of crazy, but that's a reflection of when the craft guild sort of mentality was a little bit about controlling this craft and who had access to it. Anyways, that ended, so I'm going to assume that things kind of take off from there because now so many more people can engage in this practice. But there's various things, like by the early 20th century, that's when offset printing, lithograph, comes around, and various evidence pieces out there that sort of indicate that's probably about the peak. Around 1950 is when offset takes over for mainstream commercial printing, but you still have pretty active letterpress going on in 1965 and whatnot, but it's kind of on the decline. And then, of course, in the 1990s, digital printing takes over, right? And so offset is now actually on the decline. So this is, clearly there have been these waves of technology supplanting each other, and with the rise of even offset, let alone digital printing, things like letterpress guilds and whatnot just completely fall apart, which they're not called guilds, they were called unions and whatnot. But it doesn't quite go away. There's like this little gap here, which I left in deliberately. And that's, when you start poking around, of course there's lots of shops out there that are, hardcore letterpress places. They tend to appeal to more of like the high-end design, market out there. But you can also poke around. This is just, different places. San Francisco Center for the Book, which is where I took my letterpress training and bookbinding training. And, just look in their calendar in the month of February alone, which is the shortest month of the year, I might add. 9 different classes and workshops you can sign up for. The New York Center for the Book, that's another big city that people have heard of. So I figured I'd put that in there too, and it's not surprising that they've got, their kind of book arts scene happening. And book arts includes, not just the printing, but the binding, paper making, and sometimes calligraphy. And then the Minnesota Center for the Book, which is on my radar because I'm married to a native Minnesotan, and for a time we thought about moving there. And so one of the first things I'm poking around at is can you do printmaking in Minnesota? I have flippers when I'm doing this type of research, so I'm very anxiously looking around and, oh, wonderful, Minnesota Center for the Book, you can do all these things there too. And I'm sure if you looked in other cities, I'm sure in London it's there's 5 times this much, but nonetheless, you can go, lots of places in the world, and there's still these communities training and practicing and passing on these skills, even though it's completely outdated technology. So then it's okay, well, what's the remaining commercial value, if any, for things like letterpress printing? And I'm, picking on letterpress a little bit. So poking around, the Knot actually sort of does some aggregated research on the wedding industry as a whole. And you can see that of the average spend of just something ridiculous like $36,000, I don't know what that is in pounds, but $36,000 is the average spend on a wedding in America. Totally blows my mind. And somewhere south of $500 of that is spent on invitations. Not everyone does them as letterpress by any means, but actually the majority today of wedding invitations are still done on paper, a very small percentage. So actually the total market for the paper wedding invitations I found cited at about $2.5 to $3 billion. I don't know if that's only in the U.S. or what, but that's like a sizable amount of money that's spent on some form of invitations. Some subset of that actually goes full-blown letterpress. And what's interesting also, this was something at the San Francisco Center for the Book that I learned when I was there was, in the heyday of letterpress printing, the mark of the craft was, you would have the blocks just kiss the paper, right? Just put the right amount of ink on, but absolutely leave no trace of the fact that, the actual movable type was pressing against that paper. Whereas now, when you go and you look for letterpress, what people are advertising, what people are looking for is that deboss where it's been pressed in and you can feel the texture, which is actually, in the heyday, would have basically been a totally shit job. And now that's absolutely what people want. They want that sense of handcraftedness. And actually, one of the sponsors here, Move, if you search for letterpress business cards, which is another sort of sub-market for this, is they're one of the first to show up. They've got a bunch of lovely designs that you can order, and one of the things that they're highlighting is that deboss, and then they can do a blind emboss, which is actually where there's no ink, and all they're doing is just punching a texture into the paper. So it's interesting how the mark of the craft has changed as the commercial value has shifted, right? So then other kind of anecdotes that I found, business cards fit into the general stationery market. I'm gonna just talk a little louder right now because I'm not sure the mic is working. So the stationery market in the UK is 2.1 billion pounds, and it's actually grown steadily over the last 5 years, which is a bit bizarre, right? Because you would think most of this should all be happening online. Hello. Okay. This works way better with my lounge singer persona. So, so you've got a stationery market that's actually weirdly on the rebound. I'm sure much smaller than it was in its heyday, but it's actually growing. And there's, you kind of dig into the details, and it's like the high-end personalization and various other aspects that are what's driving this. You search for letterpress on Etsy and you get 54,000 listings coming up. So there's a market, right? It's not the same as it used to be. It's kind of these weird niche areas that tend to have a lot of sentimental value. And so there's a bit of a nostalgia element to it, but this is part of the equation for driving this craft forward is kind of this intangible, unexplainable emotion, right? So maybe it's passion, maybe it's something else. Passion was just kind of the word that came to mind. But basically this explains why things that should be dead aren't dead yet, as this inexplicable emotion is sustaining it through. And I came across this quote from one of the articles where some of my random anecdotal evidence was coming from, but it resonated with me because I absolutely know this feeling. And I, first part of my career, I spent about 6 or 7 years working at a boutique investment bank Monday to Friday, and then on Saturdays I would go into the print studio and I'd spend 8 hours in there. And this was from someone who's the guilds that then became kind of the unions of letterpress workers were described as really having this wasn't just a job for them. And so things like, the smells and the sounds and the weight of the materials, all kind of had this strong kind of mysterious effect on them, right? Basically, it's a disease, and you get bitten by the bug, and then you can't get rid of it. So if anyone here has ever done printmaking and got bitten by that bug, I know what you're going through. So basically, kind of coming back to my Venn diagram, which is how I illustrate pretend authority on a subject, is okay. So we had commercial value, we had a community, and we know that just merely the intersection of these two doesn't quite sustain you, right? Because you could be supplanted. So you need this third element in there that adds the kind of that je ne sais quoi that sustains something through. So I'm going to go ahead and, I'm not totally sure if that's the answer, but let's look at another example. So another, why is this still happening? This is Matt Hummel, and he likes Porsche 356s. And those are, if you don't know, 50-year-old cars. Matt's in his 30s, and he's digging around underneath this Porsche 356. By the way, you can follow him on Instagram. I checked with him first before using this. He's got 31,000 followers. Pretty much all he posts pictures of are different shots of a beat-up 356. He's been invited to be interviewed in magazines because he just drives this thing around in the desert or wherever in places. This is a highly coveted car, and he's just driving it around. So there's actually a pretty big community of these sort of vintage car enthusiasts. So this is where it's going to get awkward. The goosebumps, by the way, when I'm talking is because it's really cold in here. So this is my T-shirt from the Motherlode Rally, which happens in June in California. This is just in the Northern California vintage car scene. There are at least 4 different rallies that happen where folks get together and they just drive for a couple of days. They literally choose to spend their time driving around in cars, which doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. It makes a lot of sense to my husband, though. So they're driving around. There's also various communities online. I'm picking on Matt. Here's where he got to go meet Jay Leno, who's sort of notorious in this arena because he's a huge classic car collector. And then you have these cars and coffee get-togethers. I sort of liken it to the meetup scene for, if you're in software, you got these meetups. Well, if you're into cars, you got cars and coffee. Sometimes there are donuts, but not always. And the coffee's usually really bad. I live in the Bay Area, in the Bay Area, and this is just a few that I pulled together. It's you could spend the first Saturday of the month going out to the Richmond district in San Francisco and hanging out with a couple hundred other car geeks, or the next day you could head over to Blackhawk and pick up another couple hundred car geeks, and then Orinda, which is where I live, which is there's 17,000 people who live there. Oh, we have our own sports cars and coffee on the 3rd Sunday of the month. Berkeley just had theirs last weekend, didn't make it, but this is it's a lifestyle. You could literally spend every weekend just hanging out and looking at other old cars, talking about it, driving them around, and it's just people choose to spend their time this way. So then it's so there's some commercial value in this, right? So maintaining these cars, there's folks who specialize in keeping them up, and running. So you've got a mix, right? There's buying and selling them. So, lots of people know eBay Motors, but you may not be familiar with things there's something called Bring a Trailer, which is also based in San Francisco. And it's an online auction site for vintage cars. And there's the chat rooms or whatever they're, threads, comment threads on these cars are just they're just geeking out on this stuff all the time. My husband is always on there. If you look at his computer, there's 50,000 windows and tabs open, most of which are looking at car parts or car auctions. So, me with letterpress or printing, it's a bit of a sickness. Also in the Bay Area, we've got Canepa, which they do car modifications, and they've got this whole racing thing, but they also do restorations. I went down there for a tour, and they actually flew in the guy from Germany, this 80-something-year-old guy who knows how to work on this highly specialized Porsche engine, right? And he's got an apprentice who he probably barely lets touch anything in the shop. But nonetheless, this is sustaining the craft, but they they sell these cars, right? Like they kind of work in this high-end market. Pebble Beach, the Concorde d'Elegance, I kept missaying it, and my husband was getting really annoyed with me. This is the big classic, show car, right? These cars do not get driven around on rallies. These cars are meticulously maintained, and the Jay Lenos of the world are the ones, owning them and whatnot. They made record auction sales last year, $91 million. This is one car auction event. And so there's dozens or hundreds of these car auctions. So the value that these antiquated machines, right? Modern cars are faster, safer, more efficient. There's really no reason for people to be driving around old cars, vintage, antique, whatever. And yet, people's sentimental attachment to them sustains an entire industry of people who will meticulously maintain and restore as original so that it can be shown at something like Pebble Beach, or do modifications. So Wevo specializes only in Porsche parts so that you can take your old Porsche, do modifications and make it faster and all these things. But you get to still drive it around, right? So there's something here that doesn't make sense. And it's things like, I bought a Testarossa last night. Is this something that comes up on your calls? When you phone home hours after having landed in London? So, and I'm going to apologize for the poor quality of the photo on the next slide, but this is the kind of stuff I get to hear about when the driveway already looks like this. Like, this doesn't make sense, right? We are beyond logic and reason. So there's a DeLorean in there. Yep, there's a lot of Germans in the stable. He's got a soft spot for those. I'm gonna just pause and come back a little bit to what is this? How might this be relevant for software? So if you look at kind of our highly authoritative triple Venn diagram. When you think about community, obvious sort of, proxy there, it's, open source, right? And open source communities that are healthy, they're, transferring knowledge constantly, they're gathering together at, whether it's local meetups or major conferences. There's absolutely, open source is within the software world, I think, a great example of community and what that looks like and how it plays out. You also have vendors, right? So commercial value vendors, like their job is to go out there and figure out how to make sure that someone is willing to pay for this, right? What is going to ultimately exercise that value for another party? But then there's kind of that, if something's going to be sustained, right? If you only have these two and it's supplantable, then this is like, okay, you're going to have the graveyard of software that is no longer used. But if it's going to be sustained, like, what is that extra element? Maybe it's you, maybe it's some disease that you have, right? And I mean that in the fondest way. So you have to. That's just sort of, I guess, the open question I have is to think about, like, is what you're working on down here, like, hey, this works for now, it has value, there's an active community, but something else is going to come along and we're going to move on from this? Or are we going to kind of keep this around? And it may not be the same size of community, which kind of brings me to my parting thoughts, which is, things when they're kind of at their peak of commercial value, and their peak of community, right? Like they have a certain size and scope to them, but that may change over time, right? Those are kind of your vanity metrics, right? Those don't necessarily illustrate whether something is sustainable or not. The ultimate test, the acid test for this is if it's actually obsolete, and it still has a community, and it still has commercial value, and it's still going. That's the part that's sustainable. And that may look different than what it looked like in its heyday. It might be a very different group of people who are kind of the commercial buyers of this craft. And the community might operate very differently. Could be less formal, right? Without kind of the organizational structure of the guild or the union. It may really be sort of just personal individuals that are very passionate about it. So that's basically all I wanted to say here today, and I look forward to meeting more of you later. Thank you.